Imagine this. It is late 1944. Berlin is shaking from distant artillery. The Eastern Front is collapsing. The Western Allies are rolling through France faster than German High Command can redraw the maps. And yet, inside hidden bunkers and underground tunnels, Adolf Hitler is staring at blueprints that look like something ripped from a science fiction novel. Jet fighters faster than anything in the sky. Rockets that can fly across the English Channel without a pilot. A wing-shaped stealth bomber that seems decades ahead of its time. And yes, even the mythical project the Internet loves a little too much. The so-called Bell. The device that supposedly bent gravity, time, and, depending on which conspiracy channel you click, probably your microwave oven. This is the world of Wunderwaffe wonder weapons. Weapons that were supposed to reverse the war, restore German dominance, and deliver a blow so shocking that the Allies would be forced into negotiations. At least, that was the dream. The reality, well, it is a lot messier. And that is exactly what we are diving into today. Not the Hollywood version. Not the Hitler almost conquered the world with alien technology version. But the real, historically accurate, document-supported truth, with just enough storytelling flavor to keep your brain awake and your coffee warm. Before we jump in, one quick thing. If you enjoy deep dives into World War II history and love having myths torn apart with hard facts, feel free to subscribe. It helps more than you think, and I promise you, we are just getting started. Now let's talk about how this myth of unstoppable wonder weapons was born. First, understand the mindset inside Nazi Germany during the last years of the war. By 1943, the German military machine had transitioned from offensive blitzkrieg to desperate defensive warfare. Men were running out, fuel was running out, time was running out. But there was still something Germany did have. Some of the smartest engineers, physicists, and aerodynamicists in the world. These were the people behind the V-shaped aircraft, the swept wings, the early computers, the first practical assault rifles, and the first operational jet fighter. Germany in the 1930s and early 1940s was a hub of wild experimentation, the kind of place where a scientist could walk into a room and say, "Hey, what if we build a plane with no tail?" And nobody would call security. But there is a twist. Germany was brilliant at inventing things. Germany was terrible at mass-producing them during a total war. For every revolutionary idea coming out of a lab in Peenemünde, there were 10 logistical problems, 5 production shortages, 3 factories bombed by the RAF, and 1 Hitler demanding the impossible by Tuesday. And that is where the myth of Wunderwaffe becomes so interesting. Because on paper, some of these weapons really did look like game changers. The Me-262 could outrun every Allied fighter by nearly 150 miles per hour. The V-2 rocket was the first long-range ballistic missile in human history. The Type 21 submarine could stay underwater for incredible periods of time, avoiding radar entirely. And the Ho-229 flying wing had a radar profile so small that modern engineers later called it a primitive stealth aircraft. So, the question becomes, if Nazi Germany had all these futuristic technologies, why did none of them change the outcome of the war? Were they too late? Too few? Too unreliable? Too misunderstood by Hitler himself? Or is the entire idea of Wunderwaffe simply an inflated legend, a desperate fantasy created by Nazi propaganda in the final months, and later amplified by post-war books, conspiracy theories, and internet clickbait? To answer that, We need to break the story into its real components. Not the myth of magical superweapons, but the actual historical categories they fall into. Real weapons that were deployed, like the V-1, V-2, and Me-262. Advanced prototypes that existed but never reached real mass production, like the Ho-229 or the America bomber. Projects that were designed but never built, like the giant land cruiser tanks. And finally, the pure fiction, the mythos, the legends, the internet favorites, Die Glocke, secret Antarctic bases, and other claims that historians politely call creative. In this series, we will break all of it down. What worked? What did not? What could theoretically have mattered? And what never stood a chance, no matter how many History Channel thumbnails put glowing blue energy behind it. And we are starting with the weapon Hitler believed would be his ultimate revenge. The V-weapons, Vergeltungswaffen, the weapons of retaliation. These were not just rockets. They were political theater, psychological warfare, and technological milestones packed into metallic tubes. In the next part, we will dive deep into the V-1 cruise missile and the V-2 ballistic missile, their actual impact, their terrifying design, the enormous cost, and why, despite all the fear they created, they were a military failure. Part 2 begins with the sound every Londoner feared, the buzzing pulse of the Doodlebug engine. Ready? Let's go. Picture London in the summer of 1944. You step outside for fresh air, maybe hoping for 5 quiet minutes before another air raid siren. And then you hear it, that low, pulsing, buzzing drone in the sky. It sounds like a lawnmower with anger issues, a sound so distinct and so hated that Londoners gave it a name, the Doodlebug. This was the V-1, the world's first operational cruise missile. Not a plane, not a rocket. A flying bomb with a pulse jet engine that coughed its way across the English Channel at roughly 400 miles per hour. When the engine cut out, you had about 10 seconds to reconsider your life choices before the explosion. So yes, it was terrifying. But the real question is, was it effective? Let's take the myth apart. The V-1 program started long before the Allies thought Germany could even dream of such a thing. The design came from the Argus Company under engineer Fritz Goslow, with additional work from the Fieseler aircraft firm. It was meant to be cheap, easy to produce, and launched in large swarms from special ramps hidden in forests across northern France. On paper, a brilliant idea. In practice, imagine trying to win a boxing match by throwing refrigerators at your opponent. It might land a hit, but it is hardly efficient. The problems were many. The V-1 was slow enough that Allied fighters could intercept it. In fact, some British pilots discovered a ridiculous but effective tactic, flying up next to a V-1 and using their wing to gently tip the bomb off course by disrupting its airflow. Yes, that means Royal Air Force pilots literally swatted missiles out of the sky with their airplanes. If you ever feel useless, remember that Germany poured enormous resources into a weapon that could be defeated by the aeronautical equivalent of a shoulder nudge. But the V-1 still caused damage. Over 6,000 were launched at Britain, with around 25% reaching London. They killed thousands of civilians, injured tens of thousands, and forced the Allies to redirect vast anti-aircraft resources. From a purely terror-based perspective, it worked. From a strategic perspective, it did not move the needle even 1 inch. Then came its bigger, faster, more infamous brother, the V-2 rocket. This one was different. This one changed human history, even if it did not change the war. The V-2 was the world's first long-range ballistic missile. No sound, no warning, no defense. It reached the edge of space, then re-entered at supersonic speed. By the time it exploded, the first thing you heard was the blast itself. This was not a terror weapon, it was psychological annihilation. Invented under Werner von Braun at Peenemünde, the V-2 represented the future of warfare, space travel, and rocketry. But here is the uncomfortable truth that historians keep pointing out. The V-2 was a strategic disaster for Germany. Each V-2 cost so many resources, rare materials, and labor hours that Germany would have been better off building 90 fighter planes instead of 10 rockets. The factories that produced them relied heavily on forced labor from the Mittelbau-Dora camp, where tens of thousands of prisoners died under horrific conditions, making the V-2 not just a technological milestone, but also one of the darkest achievements of the war. The rocket's accuracy was terrible. Its explosive payload was relatively small, and its production cost was absurd. Albert Speer himself later admitted that the entire V program consumed enormous industrial power that Germany desperately needed for airplanes and tanks. Hitler loved the V-2 for its dramatic effect, calling it his vengeance weapon, but from a military-industrial standpoint, it might as well have been a gold-plated bottle rocket. So why did Germany continue pouring effort into these weapons? Because Hitler genuinely believed that a single, spectacular victory could shock the Allies into negotiation. A fantasy, a desperate hope, a strategic illusion fueled by propaganda. Now, to be fair, there is a scenario where the V-weapons might have mattered, at least a little. If Germany had developed and deployed them 2 years earlier, before the Allies built massive radar networks and did not yet dominate the air, the impact could have been larger. Not war-winning, but significantly more disruptive. But in reality, the V-weapons served one main purpose. They terrified civilians, drained German resources, showcased brilliant engineering, and did nothing to prevent Germany's defeat. However, the V-weapons were only the beginning. They were the opening act of the Wunderwaffe myth, the spark that ignited both German propaganda and post-war conspiracy theories. And while the V-2 was impressive, it was not the most dangerous thing Germany had. Not even close. Because while the V-weapons rained down on London, factories across Germany were building something far scarier. Airplanes that could outrun anything the Allies had, climb faster, strike harder, and rewrite air combat forever. Hitler's jet age was coming. But Hitler himself was the one who almost sabotaged it. In Part 3, we dive into the Me-262, the jet fighter that could have ruled the skies, and the mind-bending flying wings that looked like UFOs decades before YouTube conspiracy channels claimed aliens were involved. Stay ready. The story is about to leave the ground. By late 1944, the skies over Germany told a very simple story. The Luftwaffe was dying. Allied bombers were flying daylight raids almost at will. The P-51 Mustang was escorting them from England all the way to Berlin and back. And the once fearsome German fighter force was down to thin numbers, low fuel, and pilots who sometimes had less than 10 hours of training before being thrown into combat. But deep inside German hangars, something extraordinary was waiting. Something that looked like it came from a future where the war had gone very differently. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. And this was not just a little better than Allied propeller planes. This thing was in a different category of physics. With speeds approaching 540 miles per hour, the Me-262 could outrun every Allied fighter by over 100 miles per hour. It could climb faster, dive faster, and deliver 4 heavy cannons that ripped bombers apart like tin cans. British test pilots who flew captured Me-26. 2 aircraft after the war described it as a leap ahead of anything we had. So why did this machine, this miracle of engineering, fail to stop the Allied air offensive? Well, for one thing, Hitler. You know that boss who walks in at the last second and changes the entire project because he watched a documentary and now thinks he is an expert? That was Hitler with the Me-262. Messerschmitt's engineers wanted a pure interceptor, a fast jet fighter designed to shred bombers. But Hitler demanded it be converted into a Blitz bomber, a jet bomber that could carry explosives to London. This decision cost Germany nearly a full year of production time. A year Germany did not have. By the time the jet was finally used in meaningful numbers, the Allies had overwhelming numerical superiority and radar networks covering the entire Western Front. Even the world's best fighter cannot save you when the enemy has 10 times more planes, 30 times more fuel, and the sky is filled with radar-guided guns. And then there were the engines. The Jumo 004 turbojet was revolutionary, but also incredibly fragile. It had a lifespan of roughly 10 to 20 hours before requiring replacement. Some engines failed after a single flight. Germany simply lacked the exotic heat-resistant metals needed for reliable jet turbine blades. High-temperature alloys were scarce because Allied bombing crippled factories like those in Essen and Wuppertal. So pilots had to fly state-of-the-art jet fighters like they were made of porcelain. Still, even with those limitations, Allied bomber crews feared the Me-262 like nothing else in the sky. But Hitler's jet revolution did not end there. In fact, some of the projects Germany was working on look so futuristic that when people first see the photos, they assume they must be fakes. Take the Horten Ho 229, a flying wing. No tail, swept wings, jet-powered, and almost invisible to Allied radar. When a prototype airframe was tested by the United States decades later, engineers at Northrop Grumman estimated that the aircraft had a significantly reduced radar signature compared to conventional planes of the era. It was not stealth in the modern sense, but it was absolutely ahead of its time. The idea that German engineers created a flying wing that resembles a 21st century stealth bomber is one of those rare moments where history really does feel like science fiction. So why did none of these aircraft fly in meaningful numbers? Because Germany's problem was not creativity, it was survival. Factories were being bombed. Fuel reserves were practically empty. Skilled pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. Even the best jet fighter in the world cannot help you when your country has no aviation fuel left. By 1945, German planes were sometimes delivered to airfields with barely enough fuel for one test flight. And yet, here is the twist that keeps historians debating. If the Me-262 had been deployed 1 year earlier as a pure fighter, it could have severely disrupted Allied bombing operations. Maybe not enough to win the war, but enough to change the pace and force new Allied countermeasures. A few hundred Me-262 fighters in mid-1944 could have caused nightmare-level losses for American bomber groups. But Germany never got them in time, never got enough of them, and never had enough fuel to use them effectively. And while the jet fighters get the spotlight, there were other German aircraft projects that looked even stranger. Like the rocket-powered Me-163 Comet, basically a flying missile with wings. It could climb faster than anything ever built during the war, reach bomber formations in minutes, and then glide home like a paper airplane with performance anxiety. Its rocket fuel was so volatile that pilots sometimes exploded during takeoff. Not exactly great for morale. Or the America Bomber Project, a plan to develop aircraft that could reach New York City, drop bombs, and return. Several designs were proposed, including the Junkers 390, the Messerschmitt Me-264, and the Taube 329. They were incredibly ambitious. They never became operational. Germany barely had the fuel to reach London at this point, let alone cross the Atlantic and come back. So what do these jets and futuristic prototypes tell us? They tell us that Nazi Germany had visionary engineers. They also tell us that Nazi Germany had terrible leadership, collapsing logistics, and a talent for sabotaging its own best ideas. It is the story of a nation that invented the future and then wasted it. But the myth of Wunderwaffe does not stop with the skies. Because while the Luftwaffe was dying, the Kriegsmarine was quietly preparing something that could have been truly dangerous. Submarines that were years ahead of Allied designs. In Part 4, we dive into the Type 21 and Type 23 U-boats, the real electric submarines that could have changed the Battle of the Atlantic if only they had arrived sooner. The ocean is calling. Let's go underwater. If the sky was slipping out of Germany's hands by 1944, there was still one battlefield where the Reich had a fighting chance: the Atlantic Ocean. For most of the war, the U-boat arm was the terror of Allied shipping. In 1942, German submarines sank so many American ships along the East Coast that U-boat captains called it the second happy time. Oil tankers burned on the horizon. Merchant convoys vanished beneath the waves. And for a while, it looked like Germany might actually starve Britain into submission. But then the Allies adapted. Radar, sonar, escort carriers, long-range bombers, Hedgehog depth-charge launchers, ultra-code breaking at Bletchley Park. By 1943, Germany's old Type 7 and Type 9 submarines were being hunted like steel dinosaurs. Their biggest problem was simple. They were designed for the 1930s, not for a world where the enemy could spot them from the sky through clouds. Germany needed something new, something faster, something quieter, something that did not have to surface every few hours like a needy houseplant. Enter the Type 21, the so-called electric submarine. A vessel so advanced that even American and British engineers were shocked when they inspected captured examples after the war. What made the Type 21 so special? First, speed underwater. Old submarines were basically surface ships that could dive when needed. Their underwater speed was 5 to 7 knots. The Type 21? It could reach up to 17 knots submerged. That was faster than many Allied escort ships. For the first time in history, a submarine could run away underwater faster than the enemy could chase it. That flips naval doctrine upside down. Second, no more constant surfacing. Traditional U-boats had to come up for fresh air frequently because diesel engines needed oxygen. That is when Allied radar-equipped planes shredded them. The Type 21 used a snorkel mast to take in air while staying mostly submerged. It was not perfect. The snorkel had issues with water pressure and radar reflection, but it was far safer than surfacing. Third, automation and firepower. Reloading torpedoes underwater used to take hours. The Type 21 could reload 6 torpedo tubes in minutes. That meant it could fire, dive deeper, change direction, and attack again before the enemy even knew what hit them. Fourth, improved batteries. Germany packed this submarine with large, high-capacity batteries, giving it far more underwater endurance than any Allied submarine of the era. It was not quite the modern nuclear submarine, but it was the closest thing the world had seen up to that point. So here is the big question. Could the Type 21 have changed the Battle of the Atlantic? The answer, uncomfortable for the Allies, and surprisingly bittersweet for historians, is maybe. If Type 21 submarines had entered service in large numbers by mid-1943, the Atlantic campaign could have become extremely bloody again. Convoys might have suffered major losses. Supplies to Britain and later to Normandy might have been seriously disrupted. The Allies might have needed new tactics, new weapons, and new escort ships. D-Day could still have happened, but logistics would have been harder, slower, and more dangerous. So why did this super submarine fail to appear in time? Well, production chaos. Imagine trying to build a cutting-edge submarine while your factories are being bombed, your workers are scattered, and your supply chains are collapsing. Oh, and the guy in charge keeps insisting the war can still be won with a combination of optimism and shouting. Albert Speer tried to introduce modern assembly line methods. Germany ordered over 1,000 Type 21s. But the reality? Only a handful were ever completed. None saw meaningful wartime combat. The few that entered service either surrendered almost immediately or performed brief patrols that changed nothing. Then there was the Type 23, a smaller coastal submarine with many of the same innovations. These were actually completed and used, and they performed well. But they were simply too late and too few. Germany was drowning by 1945, and no submarine, no matter how advanced, could save it. But just like with the jet fighters, the lesson is the same. Germany had brilliant engineers, but catastrophic timing. And here is the ironic part. After the war, every major naval power stole or politely borrowed Germany's submarine innovations. The United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France all built post-war submarine fleets inspired by the Type 21. The American Guppy conversions, the Soviet Whiskey class, even modern submarine hydrodynamics, all were influenced by this late-war German design. So yes, the Type 21 was revolutionary. Yes, it was decades ahead. And yes, it could have been genuinely dangerous if it had existed 2 years earlier. But the legend of Wunderwaffe does not end at sea. Because while the jet fighters and submarines were real, tangible, demonstrably advanced technologies, there is another side to this story. The side that YouTube thumbnails love way too much. The side filled with secret bases, impossible machines, and glowing blue orbs. In Part 5, we enter the world of the myths. Die Glocke, miracle energy weapons, Antarctica bunkers, UFO-shaped prototypes, and every bizarre claim that has turned Hitler's science division into pop culture magic. And yes, we will separate what has a grain of truth from what belongs directly in a late-night documentary marathon. Get ready! This is where Wunderwaffe goes from engineering to legend. Now we enter the part of the story that the Internet loves a little too much. This is where history meets conspiracy, where engineering meets imagination, and where late-night documentaries start playing ominous synth music for no reason. Because when people hear Hitler's wonder weapons, half the time they are not imagining jet fighters or advanced submarines. They are imagining glowing spheres, levitating machines, UFO-shaped aircraft, underground Antarctic bases, and a mysterious device that supposedly bent gravity, like it was part of a weekend yoga class. Let's talk about Die Glocke the Bell. If you spend enough time online, you will see claims that Die Glocke was everything from an anti-gravity engine to a time machine to a teleportation device to something that could power an interdimensional portal. The descriptions usually involve purple light, rotating cylinders, and victims melting into gel. So already 10 out of 10 for creativity. 0 out of 10 for engineering feasibility. So where did this legend come from? The story originated in the 1990s with a Polish journalist who interviewed former SS officers and speculated heavily based on vague descriptions. There is no surviving blueprint, no recovered prototype, no documentation, and no Allied intelligence report confirming its existence. Considering how thorough Allied technical teams were after the war, that tells you something. Did Nazi Germany experiment with exotic physics? Yes, in the same sense that a kid experimenting with a magnifying glass is doing solar research. They tested centrifuges, heavy elements, rotational devices, high-voltage equipment, all of which sound mysterious if you do not know what you are looking at. Most likely, Die Glocke was a combination of chemical experiments, radiation research, centrifugal separation, and a large dose of late-war German secrecy. That is it. No teleportation, no bending space-time, no Nazi UFO parked behind a mountain in Argentina. But speaking of UFOs, here is where things get a bit more interesting. Because, while there was no alien technology, Nazi Germany did produce aircraft that looked absolutely bizarre to Allied eyes. The flying wing designs by the Horten brothers genuinely resembled the shape of modern stealth bombers. Some German engineers also sketched circular or disc-like aircraft concepts. None of these flew. None were practical. But the shapes alone helped feed the post-war UFO craze. Think about it. A German engineer draws a circular aircraft in 1944. The Soviets capture the blueprint. The United States captures the other half. Both sides build experimental prototypes in the 1950s. And suddenly, farmers in Kansas are reporting glowing discs in the sky. Were they aliens? No. More like classified Cold War aircraft with terrible stability problems. Then there is the myth of the Antarctic base 211. According to the legend, the SS escaped to Antarctica, built a secret city beneath the ice, created advanced flying craft, and lived happily ever after while plotting world domination from inside an igloo that somehow had central heating. It is a great story. It is also physically impossible. Nazi Germany did send expeditions to Antarctica for whaling rights and territorial claims. They built a temporary base that failed because the ice crushed the structures. There is zero evidence of underground caverns, secret tunnels, or hidden factories. And considering how many Allied ships and aircraft scanned the region during the International Geophysical Year, someone would have noticed a massive UFO hangar under 300 feet of ice. The same goes for the legend that Hitler escaped to Argentina with prototypes of advanced technology. No, he died in Berlin. The technology was either destroyed, captured, or integrated into Allied research programs. But here is the important thing. Not all Wunderwaffe myths are total nonsense. Some come from real prototypes, misunderstood projects, or fragments of truth twisted into dramatic stories. For example, the sun gun. There really was a German concept to put a giant mirror in space to focus sunlight as a weapon. Not even remotely feasible with 1940s technology. But the idea existed. The wind cannon. Yes, Germany actually tried to build a cannon that fired compressed air to knock down aircraft. It did not work at all. But the prototype existed. The sound cannon. Also real. Also useless. Also probably terrifying to anyone standing too close. The giant tanks. The Landkreuzer P-100 and the P-1000 Rata enormous fantasy tanks the size of apartment blocks. They were sketched, but never built. The steel alone would have required dismantling half of Germany's bridges. And perhaps the strangest real project, the Gustav and Dora railway guns artillery pieces so massive they required 3,000 men to operate and could fire shells the size of a small car. They worked in the same way building an entire highway to move one truck works. So why did Germany chase these impossible ideas? Because by 1944, the Reich was collapsing. Desperation breeds fantasy. German propaganda needed miracles. Hitler needed hope, or at least the illusion of it. And the world needed an explanation for how a once powerful nation could lose so absolutely. Wunderwaffe became the myth that filled the psychological vacuum. After the war, authors exaggerated it. The Cold War supercharged it. Hollywood dramatized it. YouTube memed it. But underneath the legend lies the real story. Germany had incredible scientists and catastrophic leadership, groundbreaking ideas and collapsing industry, brilliance and chaos. And while the myths are entertaining, the truth is far more revealing. Because the real question is not, did Hitler have wonder weapons? He did real, physical, advanced ones. The real question is, could any of them have changed the war? And that is exactly what we answer in Part 6, the final section. A full breakdown of which Wunderwaffe could have mattered, which ones never had a chance, and the one Allied project that overshadowed them all. Get ready for the conclusion. This is where everything comes together. We have walked through rockets that reach the edge of space, jet fighters that push the limits of aerodynamics, submarines that looked like the blueprint for the Cold War Navy, and enough myths to keep late-night documentaries fully booked for the next 50 years. Now, it is time to answer the one question that has hovered over this entire story, like the shadow of a V-2 rocket. Could any of Hitler's real wonder weapons have changed the outcome of the war? To answer that honestly, we need to look at the war not as a collection of dramatic episodes, but as a system of logistics, economics, resources, and timing the things that do not fit neatly into action scenes, but decide the fate of nations far more reliably than any secret blueprint. Let us begin with the most tempting candidate, the Me-262 jet fighter. Historians often describe it as the only genuinely war-changing weapon Germany possessed. If deployed a year earlier and in large numbers, It could have inflicted devastating losses on American bomber formations. Imagine waves of Me-262s tearing through B-17 and B-24 groups before they reached their targets, degrading the Allied strategic bombing campaign to such a degree that factories in the Ruhr and synthetic fuel plants might have survived longer. Even a few extra months of fuel, steel, and rail production could have complicated the Allied advance significantly. But this imagined scenario runs into harsh reality. Germany lacked the high-temperature alloys needed for reliable jet turbine blades. Even if Hitler had not interfered and insisted on a bomber variant, Germany still needed chromium, nickel, and molybdenum that were nearly impossible to obtain by late 1943. Without those materials, engine lifespan remained catastrophically low. So even in the most optimistic alternate timeline, the Me-262 might have bought time, created chaos, and forced the Allies to adapt, but not reverse the course of the war. A jet fighter cannot compensate for the collapse of a nation's industrial base. Next, consider the Type 21 submarine, arguably the most advanced naval vessel produced by any nation during the war. If these submarines had entered service earlier, they could have reopened the Battle of the Atlantic in a way that forced the Allies to devote even more resources to convoy protection. Supplies to Britain might have become unstable again. Delays to the D-Day invasion could have occurred, and the entire timing of the European campaign might have shifted. But again, this scenario assumes a level of production stability Germany simply did not have by 1943. The Type 21 required an enormous industrial effort. Even the modular construction method collapsed under the pressure of Allied bombing, shortages of trained labor, and the overall breakdown of the transport system. A revolutionary submarine is useless if it remains half-assembled in a shipyard that no longer receives steel deliveries. Then there are the V weapons, the V1 and V2. These are the weapons that terrified civilians, impressed engineers, and dominated propaganda. They also consumed resources so vast that Albert Speer later admitted the program weakened Germany's conventional military production. The V2, in particular, was a technological milestone with practically no strategic value. The cost of a single rocket could have produced several fighter aircraft or a dozen tanks. Even if Germany had built twice as many V2s, the effect would have remained the same. Devastating for the people of London, yes, but militarily irrelevant. What about late-war experimental aircraft? The flying wings, the rocket interceptors, the long-range bomber concepts. They looked incredible on paper. But most were prototypes that required industrial stability Germany no longer possessed. The Ho-229 flying wing impressed post-war engineers precisely because it never reached mass production. Many of these aircraft would have required months of refinement before they could be combat-ready. And Germany did not have months, it barely had weeks. So if none of these weapons could realistically turn the tide, what did? The uncomfortable truth is that the outcome of the war was shaped not by a single weapon, but by overwhelming industrial and logistical superiority. The United States alone produced more aircraft, tanks, rifles, trucks, and fuel than all Axis countries combined. The Soviet Union, despite staggering losses, relocated factories, mobilized millions, and built a mechanized army that grew stronger every single year. Britain mastered radar, code-breaking, convoy systems, and strategic bombing. Against this kind of coordinated industrial giant, Germany was crushed, long before any superweapon could save it. Ironically, the closest thing to a true wonder weapon was not German at all, it was the Manhattan Project. While Germany struggled to produce enough fuel for its tanks, the United States created a scientific and industrial program so enormous that it consumed resources equivalent to the entire German aviation industry. The atomic bomb, radar networks, proximity fuses, Liberty ships mass-produced on assembly lines, the P-51 Mustang that turned the air war, these were the technologies that changed the war decisively. This leads us to the final conclusion, one that feels almost poetic. Germany was full of brilliant thinkers, but led by a man who did not understand technology, logistics, or the realities of modern war. Hitler believed in shock, intimidation, and miracles. He believed a single weapon could overwhelm nations that were outproducing him 10-1. He believed in spectacle rather than strategy. And in the end, that belief doomed Germany. The story of Wunderwaffe is not the story of weapons that were almost unstoppable. It is the story of a nation that tried to innovate its way out of strategic disaster and failed because innovation cannot replace factories, fuel, manpower, or rational leadership. But it is also a story filled with incredible engineering achievements that influenced the world long after the war ended. The V-2 rocket became the ancestor of modern spaceflight. The jet designs shaped future aviation. The Type 21 submarine became the blueprint for post-war navies. Even the flying wing concept eventually led to aircraft like the B-2 Spirit. This is the real legacy of Hitler's wonder weapons, not world domination, but technological evolution. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history and want more long-form investigations like this, feel free to subscribe before you go. It helps the channel grow, keeps these documentaries alive, and gives us a chance to explore even more myths, mysteries, and turning points from the past.